听力考试现在开始。
Test for English Majors 2023, Grade 8, Part 1, Listening Comprehension. Section A, Mini Lecture. In this section, you will hear a mini lecture. You will hear the mini lecture once only. While listening to the mini lecture, complete the gap-filling task on Answer Sheet 1 and write no more than 3 words for each gap. Make sure what you fill in is both grammatically and semantically acceptable. You may use the blank sheet for note-taking. You have 30 seconds to preview the gap-filling task. Now listen to the mini lecture. When it is over, you'll be given 3 minutes to check your work. Metaphors in speaking. Good morning, everyone. Today, we'll continue our discussion on the art of speaking, focusing on the use of metaphors in speaking. Now, why do we need to talk about metaphors in speaking? Well, according to research findings, we utter about 6 metaphors a minute, and metaphorical thinking is essential to how we understand ourselves and others, how we communicate, learn, discover, and invent. Actually, metaphor is a way of thought before it is a way with words. Now, to assist me in explaining this, I've enlisted the help of a man whose contributions to the field are so tremendous that he himself has become a metaphor. I am, of course, referring to none other than Elvis Presley. His All Shook Up is such a touching love song. It's also an example of how we inevitably resort to metaphor when we deal with anything abstract, like ideas, emotions, feelings, concepts, thoughts. In this, Elvis is following Aristotle's classic definition of metaphor. That is, metaphor is the process of giving the thing a name that belongs to something else. And this is the mathematics of metaphor. X equals Y. It's very simple, isn't it? This formula works wherever metaphor is present. Elvis used metaphor, and so does Shakespeare, in this famous line from Romeo and Juliet. That is, Juliet is the sun. Now here, Shakespeare gives the thing, Juliet, a name that belongs to something else, the sun. In fact, whenever we give a thing a name that belongs to something else, we give it a whole network of analogies too. We mix and match what we know about the metaphor's source, in this case, the sun, with what we know about its target, Juliet. And metaphor gives us a much more vivid understanding of Juliet than if Shakespeare had literally described just what she looks like. So how do we make and interpret metaphors? This might look familiar. The first step is pattern recognition. Metaphor is not just the detection of patterns. Instead, it is the creation of patterns. And the second step is conceptual synesthesia. And what is synesthesia? It is the experience of a stimulus received by one sense organ in another sense organ as well. For example, like colored hearing. People with colored hearing actually see colors when they hear the sounds of words or letters. We all have synesthetic abilities, and many of the metaphors we use every day are synesthetic. For instance, silence is sweet, neckties are loud. So metaphor creates a kind of conceptual synesthesia in which we understand one concept in the context of another. let's move on to the third step. That is cognitive dissonance. There is a test called the Stroop test. What you need to do is identify, as quickly as possible, the color of the ink in which words of color are printed. If you're like most people, you will experience a moment of cognitive dissonance where the name of the color is printed in a differently colored ink. For example, the word red is printed in blue ink. Then you may wonder what the test intends to tell us. Well, the test shows that we cannot overlook the literal meaning of words even when the literal meaning gives the wrong answer. Stroop tests have been done with metaphor as well. The participants had to identify as quickly as possible the literally false sentences. They took longer to reject metaphors as false than they did to reject literally false sentences. Why? Because we cannot ignore the metaphorical meaning of words either. For example, one of the sentences was, "Some jobs are jails." Now, unless you're a prison guard yourself, the sentence, "Some jobs are jails," is literally false. Sadly, it's metaphorically true. And the metaphorical truth interferes with our ability to identify it as literally false. Metaphor matters because it's around us every day, all the time. How and in what ways does metaphor matter? Well, I'd say metaphor matters first of all because it creates expectations. So pay careful attention the next time you read some financial news. Agent metaphors describe price movements as the deliberate action of a living thing, as in, the Nasdaq climbed higher. Object metaphors describe price movements as non-living things, as in, the Dow fell like a brick. Researchers once asked a group of people to read market commentaries and then predict the next day's price trend. Those exposed to agent metaphors had higher expectations that price trends would continue. And they had those expectations because agent metaphors imply the deliberate action of a living thing pursuing a goal. If, for example, house prices are routinely described as climbing and climbing, higher and higher, people might naturally assume that rise is incessant. Also, metaphor matters because it influences decisions by activating analogies. Let me give you an example, which was actually an experiment. A group of students was told that a small country had been invaded and had asked for help, and they had to make a decision. What should they do? Intervene? Appeal to the United Nations? Or just do nothing? They were each then given one of the three descriptions of this hypothetical crisis. Each of the three descriptions was designed to trigger a different historical analogy. World War II, Vietnam, and the third was historically neutral. Those exposed to the World War II scenario made more interventionist recommendations than the others. This shows that just as we cannot ignore the literal meaning of words, we cannot ignore the analogies that are triggered by metaphor. Metaphor matters because it opens the door to discovery. Whenever we solve a problem or make a discovery, we compare what we know with what we don't know. And the only way to find out about the latter is to investigate the ways it might be like the former. Now we know that metaphor is ubiquitous, yet it's hidden. But you just have to look at the words around you, and you'll find it. Ralph Waldo Emerson described language as fossil poetry. But before, it was fossil metaphor, and these fossils still breathe. Okay, let me sum up today's lecture. We've looked at how metaphor is defined, how people understand metaphors, and how metaphors might influence people's expectations and decisions. Before we call it a day, I'd like to walk you through a famous quote from Francis Bacon. Some books are to be tasted, others swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. Well, how many metaphors are there in the statement? That's your takeaway homework. Now you have 3 minutes to check your work. This is the end of Section A, mini lecture. Section B, interview. In this section, you'll hear one interview. The interview will be divided into 2 parts. At the end of each part, 5 questions will be asked about what was said. Both the interview and the questions will be spoken once only. After each question, there will be a 10-second pause. During the pause, you should read the 4 choices of A, B, C, and D and mark the best answer to each question on answer sheet 2. You have 30 seconds to preview the choices. Now, listen to part 1 of the interview. Questions 1 to 5 are based on part 1 of the interview.
Good evening, everybody. Today, we are delighted to have invited Jim Johnson, a GapYear.com's spokesperson, to talk about gap year. So, whether you're currently deciding whether a gap year is for you, or you're just feeling itchy to decide what to do with it, you are welcome to join us. Well, Jim.
Thanks. I'm very pleased to meet you all.
Now, let me first ask you a question. Why should young people be thinking seriously about taking a gap year?
Well, I get asked this question all the time. People will tell you that a gap year boosts your CV, that it makes you more employable, or that it even prepares you for a life at university. Well, this is the case, but I find not enough people put an emphasis on just how amazing a gap year really is. It's a life-changing experience, and it's unbelievable how much fun you can have on a gap year.
So, what is the best thing about taking a gap year?
I think taking a gap year is like making a journey. It's an education, an exploration, and an adventure. You learn so much about exotic cultures and traditions, their culinary art, their political system, their religion. In each new location, you're learning more and more, and that ultimately adds more value to yourself, which is the best thing, I think.
What did your gap year involve?
I traveled for 2 years through Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia. Backpacking, volunteering, and moonlighting abroad. So I had a pretty comprehensive gap. To put it simple, it was the best 2 years in my life.
It can be difficult to decide what to do and where to go on your gap year. So, what advice would you have for people finding it tricky?
Good question. The most important thing is research and planning. That is, sit down with a map and a sheet of paper. List where you want to go and why. Maybe even throw in a pros and cons column. Others may advise talking to friends with some experience of gap year or browse some online forums, which I personally would not highly recommend. Don't choose what is the best out there, but what is most appropriate for you.
Okay, let's move on to another question. Which project would you do if you were taking a gap year?
I'm a bit of a diving nut, so I would go for the Madagascar Marine Conservation and Diving Project. It's got everything you want. It's relatively cheap, especially when you consider what you're getting, and you get to learn all about marine conservation. Oh, and it's in Madagascar, one of the best places to go diving in the world.
Do employers or universities care what you've done on your gap year?
Yes, they really do. If you're studying veterinary science and you volunteer on a wildlife conservation project, then that can really boost your CV and experience levels by doing so. Recently, at GapYear.com, we conducted a survey asking HR professionals whether a gap year makes a job applicant more employable. 63% agreed that a constructive gap year, either just a few months or a year sharp, spent volunteering or gaining work experience overseas, makes a job application stand out. So the evidence is there. This is the end of part 1 of the interview. Questions 1 to 5 are based on what you have just heard. Question 1. What is part 1 of the interview mainly about? Question 2. According to the man, why should young people think seriously about taking a gap year? Question 3. What does the man say about the best thing of taking a gap year? Question 4. What is the man's advice for young people before they start a gap year? Question 5. According to the man, what kind of gap year experience do employers care most? Now, listen to part 2 of the interview. Questions 6 to 10 are based on part 2 of the interview.
Now, Jim, you said a gap year can be just a few months. So, what if people don't want to take a whole year out?
Well, everyone gets confused when you say gap year. They're like, what? It's a whole year? No, it's not. A gap year is just time out between life stages. People from all ages and all backgrounds take a gap year, you know. And the majority of this time, I'd say it's usually only for 3 to 9 months. Anyway, back to the question. If people only want to travel for a month or so, then there are a number of short gap options. For example, they can travel around China or Southeast Asia taking in the sights. They can volunteer in South America, and they can go on an overland tour in Africa. There are endless opportunities out there. All you need to do is decide what it is you want to see and do. Short gaps are like ultra-concentrated gap years.
Now, another question. You yourself traveled and volunteered in your gap year. So, why is that a good option?
Because you're not only making a direct difference to local people's lives, but you're also learning more about a specific culture and society. Often you can learn a lot more about an area volunteering than just traveling around.
We'd love to find out what is on people's travel list. Could you tell us yours?
I think a travel list has to be as ridiculous as possible. It has to be made up of things that are achievable and things that are perhaps unachievable. After all, what do you do when you've done everything? On my travel list, number 1, cage diving with great white sharks. Number 2, hitchhiking across America from New York to San Francisco. Number 3, touring overland in Africa. And number 4 is climbing Mount Komolangma, which, let's be honest, I need to think twice.
So, Jim, you've traveled a huge amount for somebody who's only 26 years old. I'm curious, how did you get the travel bug?
Well, firstly, I grew up in an international household with a German mother and an Italian-American father. So our daily lives and conversations always were more global in a lot of ways. Thus, I always saw the world as small and attainable. Secondly, when I was 16, I left home to go to the United World College, which is a 2-year boarding school with students from 90 different countries. There, I really grew to see the entire world as an interconnected place and began to think of myself less with national identities and more through global and human lenses. These 2 things really explain my love for the world and help to explain my love for travel, I guess.
Oh, I see. And what will visiting every country in the world mean to you personally?
For me, it'll be about how much I've learned. It'll be a validation of my ability to think critically and analyze the different ways that societies try to function. There's so much to learn from personal experience of being in a place. And I love travel because to me, it's about constant learning.
Yeah, travel broadens one's mind. As the saying goes, well, Jim, thank you very much for joining us on the interview.
My pleasure. This is the end of part 2 of the interview. Questions 6 to 10 are based on what you have just heard. Question 6. What does the man say about a gap year? Question 7. According to the man, why is volunteering a good option? Question 8. Which of the following activities is the man least likely to do? Question 9. What contributes to the man's love for travelling? Question 10. What does the man see as a personal benefit of global travelling? This is the end of Section B interview. This is the end of Part 1 listening comprehension.